And of course, with all the rhetoric, and we finished with Melito, that was being leveled against the Jewish people were increasingly going to be on the defensive. There were some things about Christian theology that were in and of themselves offensive to the Jews. One of those was what they perceived as a denial of the uniqueness of God, despite the church having among its members many Jews. Another is the denial of the Jewish people, as the church, in its supersessionist way, claimed to be the Jewish people, and more. So the complement of attacks against the Jewish people was responded with by the Jewish community as well. And we can see a little bit about the franc exchange that took place in various debates that took place between Jews and Christians in the first centuries. For example, Tertullian says that he attended one. And then we have the dialogue, the famous dialogue between Justin Martyr and Trypho, which is depicted as taking place in a public setting with friends of both and observers as well taking part in this discussion where many people were present. And Origen also mentions one such debate where many people were present. We might not forget Cyprian of Carthage. He lived from 200 to 258 BC. That's in the 3rd century, the third of the 3 centuries we're looking at this morning. He wrote a testimonia which was intended to serve as a guide in such debates. The arguments included the point that the Jews would lose Jerusalem and leave the land they had inherited. Another bullet point or talking point was that 2 people were foretold, a greater and a lesser, the old people of the Jews and the new one which would consist of us, that is the church. Another talking point, the Jews have fallen seriously under the wrath of God because they forsook the Lord and followed idols. That's turning the Jewish argument on its head. Also, because they did not believe the prophets and murdered them. It doesn't sound like good news for the Jews here. And the explicit punitive supersessionism in all of these statements could not have endeared itself to those who knew themselves to be the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As is the case sometimes today, debates between Jews and Christians in some ways did not bring the 2 sides closer together, but actually increased their alienation and possibly served both sides in that respect, in that for the Jewish people it would demonstrate the offensiveness of the Christian argument, and for the Christians they would demonstrate the obtuseness of the Jewish people. The most notable of those who utilized supersessionism as a double-edged sword to both evangelize the unbeliever and to separate Christianity to show it superior from Judaism was, of course, Justin Martyr, 110 to 165 CE. Justin was a Gentile, but he was someone who had some familiarity with the Jewish people because he was born in Shomron. He was born in Samaria. Justin was therefore intimately familiar with the Jewish people, having lived through, but in other words, living both before and after the Second Great Revolt, which ended in 135 CE. He is an early writer, but he demonstrates that as a result, with his perspective, the name Christian still had some of its negative connotations. People were still throwing it at the early believers. It's his lengthy dialogue with Trypho, though, that deserves our attention. While there remains considerable discussion as to whether Trypho's a real person or is he just a literary fictional person or a composite. The fact that Justin could and did use the literary device of a public debate demonstrates that, yes, these debates were known in his world. And then secondly, the sheer volume of argumentation in this letter in a day when long writings were not as common as they are today tells us that Justin spent a lot of time developing these arguments, no doubt in the context of debate with Jewish people. The debate has a lot of warmth in it. There's kind of personal warmth between Trypho and Justin. That too we can take as possibly quite, and maybe likely, quite descriptive of relationships among many Jews and Gentiles. But the language is not for the thin-skinned. The various arguments, the way they are framed, and their language are strong, even harsh and accusatory at times. Throughout, the terminology from Justin's side is an us versus you approach. And of course, Trypho echoes the same. In this long discussion that takes place over a long period of time, days, in issues concerning Yeshua's messiahship and the validity of the law, the Torah, are discussed. Not all of the arguments are factual, but based on things that people believed at the time. Thus, Justin accuses the Jewish people of having cut verses out of the prophecy of Jeremiah, a clearly false charge that's nonetheless difficult to disprove. Because if all your copies of Jeremiah don't have such and such a verse, that proves to the Christian that they're right. It was cut out when such a verse never existed. Justin argues, as we noted in the last hour, about the pre-existence of Christianity. Christianity being this thing that began even before the Jewish people. He talks about prophecies concerning Christianity and of the nations accepting it. And he culminates with a supersessionist bent, to put it mildly. He quotes Isaiah 65, where we read, "And in his name the Gentiles shall trust." He asks, "Then is it Jacob, the patriarch, in whom the Gentiles and yourselves shall trust, or is it not Christ? As therefore Christ is the Israel and the Jacob, even so we who have been quarried out from the bowels of Christ are the true Israelitic race. But let us attend rather to the very word, and I will bring forth," he says, "the seed out of Jacob and out of Judah, and it shall inherit my holy mountain, and mine elect and my servants shall possess the inheritance and shall dwell there. And there shall be folds of flocks in the thicket, and the valley of Achor shall be a resting place of cattle for the people who have sought me. But as for you who forsake me, and forget my holy mountain, and prepare a table for demons, and fill out drink for the demon, I shall give you the sword." And that's clearly directed against the Jewish people in this context of the destruction of Jerusalem and its taking away from the Jewish people. This punitive supersessionism where the elect inherit the inheritance that God is giving. What more can be said about Justin? Supersessionism is once again significant. This is another example from the Christian side in the developing chasm between the church and the Jewish people. From the Jewish side, the argument continues, and we'll get back to the Birkat HaMinim, this blessing, so-called, being a key in the separation, at least in some people's minds, between the Jewish people and the church. It's a rabbinic term, and it denotes sectarians. As such, the term minim does not refer exclusively to any one sect, but there is little doubt that it does include Messianic Jews. Traditionally, a Baraita to Berachot, Babylonian Talmud Berachot 28, says that Samuel the Lesser composed a benediction on the Minim, the curse on heretics that is to this day part of the daily Amidah, or standing prayer. Following that, it became the rule to expel those who erred in how they said this benediction for fear that he was a min, or sectarian. Lawrence Schiffman took this at face value in 1985, and it is still the majority opinion that the Birkat HaMinim was composed primarily with Jewish disciples of Yeshua in mind. A 2020 article by Israel Yuval in Haaretz, the newspaper Haaretz, on the Vatican Council was recently entitled, "We Curse Christianity 3 times a day. Can Jews and Christians truly reconcile?" That was the take. The benediction, a copy of which was found in the Cairo Geniza, a repository for worn-out ancient texts, biblical texts with the name of God in them, in Egypt, read, "For the apostates, let there be no hope, and let the arrogant government be speedily uprooted in our days. Let the Notzrim and the Minim," that's the Christians and the heretics, "be destroyed in a moment, and let them be blotted out of the book of life, and not be inscribed together with the righteous. Blessed art thou, O Lord, who humblest the arrogant." Today, a version of this, toned down a little bit, is found in the Amidah, but it is clearly not specifically against Christians, but that is what the article in Haaretz was referring to. It should be noted that this paragraph is viewed as directed at as much at internal problems in the community and dissidents as it is directed externally. But I want to argue and raise what I view as the likelihood that we should reassess the Birkat HaMinim. And while there was clearly some level of repudiation of false teachings going on in Judaism in many different directions in the first 3 centuries, and while there were clearly curses being made, nevertheless, this was not primarily something where Christians were at the center. I think sometimes we have a tendency to think we're Jewish believers, to think we're at the center of a controversy when maybe we weren't as important as sometimes we might like to think. So since Schiffman's traditional take, there's been a marked shift in the scholarly consensus. In 2016, I've been reading along this line, I came across a few paragraphs in a book by Andreas Köstenberger called A Theology of John's Gospel and Letters that summarizes the recent trends in scholarship very nicely, and I'm quoting it here because I think it's helpful. In 1982, Shai Cohen wrote an essay to the effect that the Yavne sages actually had a remarkably inclusive spirit, cursing only those unwilling to commit to ideological pluralism. The same year saw the publication of William Horbury's influential study on the textual development of the 12th benediction. This is the Birkat HaMinim, so-called blessing against the heretics, that demonstrated the insecure textual foundation of the Martin view. And Martin view is Louis Martin, who is a champion of the traditional view regarding this. In 1983, Jacob Neusner showed that the Yavne sage Eliezer ben Hirkana displayed a remarkably irenic spirit toward other groups within Judaism, even toward Samaritans. In 1984, Stephen Katz strongly opposed the view that Yavne launched an official attack on Jewish Christians, and in 1985, Wayne Meeks declared, later echoed by Graham Stanton in 1992, that the Birkat HaMinim constitutes a red herring in Johannine research, in other words, in research into the Gospel of John. And so we see that there's been a trend away from the idea that the Birkat HaMinim is reflected in the Gospel of John as a relatively late Christian document talking about and alluding to this type of persecution of Jewish believers. More recently, Philip Alexander has maintained that the existence of the Birkat HaMinim can be traced back with some confidence to the first half of the 2nd, but not necessarily the 1st, century CE. According to him, labeling someone as a min identified that person not necessarily as a Christian, but as one who did not accept the authority of the rabbis, who in effect condemned all those who were not of their party, setting themselves up as the custodians of orthodoxy. The curses, rather than singling out Messianic Christians, were introduced to establish albinism as orthodoxy within the synagogue. In other words, their particular brand of Pharisaism. Ruth Langer, who has devoted an entire book to the Birkat HaMinim, concludes her study on its origins with a caution. We do know from Justin Martyr and others that Christians understood that Jews were cursing them in their synagogues, but we cannot know whether Justin had first-hand knowledge, was reporting a rumor, or was constructing an accusation for his own purposes. We cannot know whether the Birkat HaMinim in its earliest stages cursed Christians specifically, or if it did, whether Christians were just one group among many addressed by the malediction. Without more specific information about the earliest versions of the text, we are hampered in our ability to draw conclusions. This is partly because the Talmud was written quite a bit later than the period we're talking about, centuries later, and so its record of the origin of the blessing cannot necessarily be relied upon, but could actually be reflecting current issues that were going on in the Babylonian, never mind, not the Palestinian, but the Babylonian Talmud community. Distanced by time as well as distance. If I may offer my personal opinion at this point, it is that there are enough issues, even today, dividing the Jewish people from the church, unless we are certain that the Birkat HaMinim was actually leveled against Christian or Messianic Jews and the Christians in general. We would do well not to magnify it and to hold our peace. So we've looked at some earlier and later authors. We've looked at Jewish and Christian viewpoints and seen persistent Judeo-Christianity as well with its Jewish focus. We've seen how the division between the church and the Jewish people was beginning to take place. We've also seen how it can calcify and grow and is problematic even today. In all of this, a key issue has been the supersessionism that has become more and more evident. As we saw in the first hour this morning, issues such as Israel's ongoing peoplehood in relationship to God, Israel's ongoing relationship to the Torah, and Israel's committed worship of one God and one God alone were key in the early division, and so they are today. We continue to talk a little bit more about the parting of the ways in supersessionism, to point out that if Christians had seen the destruction of the temple in the First Jewish War as divine judgment, and the total destruction of Jerusalem in the Second War as a confirmation of their estimation the first time, to them God had clearly rejected and punished the Jews, and the church was absolutely in heir to all the promises of Israel. The destruction of Jerusalem confirming to the church in its growing supersessionism, its idea that the Jewish people and Israel were no longer part of the plan, played into the hands of those who were also on the Jewish side having problems with those among them in the Jewish world, and maybe some from without, who were claiming that Jesus, Yeshua, was the Messiah. For the Gentile Christian world, which also included some Jewish believers, they nevertheless confirmed that the Jewish people as a whole had to be rejected by God in favor of the nations who had supposedly accepted him. The biblical and even historical basis for this was and is slim. While on the cross, Yeshua had said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This was hardly the language of supersessionism, replacement theology, as we sometimes call it today. Rav Shaul had spoken about blindness in part that had happened to Israel. This was also hardly the language of supersessionism because it was partial, and it was something that happened, not something that was a part of a program, so to speak, or punitive, rather. Historically, Gentile Christians were by far the majority towards the end of our period of believers in Yeshua, but they were also by far the minority among the people in the world. They would not become a force in the Roman Empire until the 4th century, and to this day, of course, still are not anywhere close to being a majority of the world population. There was a double standard that was and is at play. The Jews were considered rebellious because only a minority had accepted the Messiah, but the Christian world could not demonstrate on its own that it was the majority of the nations that had supposedly accepted the Messiah. All the Jews were supposed to be believers, else the Jewish people were to be condemned, whereas a token minority of the nations accepting Yeshua as the Messiah was enough to justify the accusation that the Gentiles have believed instead of the Jews. This is a caricature by which the Jewish people have been depicted throughout church history. In real terms, the church's supersessionism in our time period was symbolized by the appointment of Marcus as bishop of the holy city called Aelia Capitolina. Aelia Capitolina is the city of Jerusalem as it was renamed by Hadrian with his family name Aelia, and the word Capitolina with an O, just like the U.S. Capitol, designating it as a place of worship of Jupiter. After 15 Jewish bishops since Yeshua, Marcus was the first Gentile one. Of course, Jews could not enter Jerusalem anymore. He therefore presided over an exclusively Gentile Jerusalem church since Jews could not enter. This was the end of any primacy of Jerusalem, and now the church would increasingly turn to Rome, the church that resided in the capital of the Roman Empire. Rather than standing up for their brothers in faith in Yeshua, the church took its opportunity to co-opt the bishopric of the Jews' most holy place. So in some ways, we can see that there was less of a parting of the ways, and I'm saying in some ways, between Messianic Jews and their Jewish brethren than between the Gentile church and their Messianic Jewish brethren as the Gentile church began to cut itself off from what we now call its Jewish roots. Messianic Jews who lived as Jews still had a place within the Jewish world, albeit under suspicion and censure. And while Jerusalem continued to be tremendously symbolic, and Messianic Jews lived throughout Syria, the Galilee, and Transjordan, wherever Jews lived. Messianic Jews at this time also had the same complaints against Rome as other Jews. They too endured the same trials, and they were not the only ones by far to avoid engaging, as we mentioned earlier, in the military struggle alongside Akiva and Bar Koziba. The picture is complex, as we've tried to demonstrate in the last while. In reality, Jews, including Messianic Jews and Christians in their various communities, continued to be intertwined. In some places, this would continue for centuries beyond, giving rise even to the papers recently written on the reaction and absorption by Jewish Christianity of the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. There were still some remnants that had to reckon with that. So while the overwhelming majority of writers assume that the Jewish wars sealed the deal, parting the ways of Judaism and Christianity, the picture is far more varied. In terms of the crippling of Christian Judaism and the focusing of Christianity on a more Pauline model, a model articulated for the Jewish world, there are only partial truths. That's why among specialists in the origin of Christianity and Judaism, the matter is far from so clear-cut. Leading scholars now view the parting of the ways as an outdated and simplistic view, even as I think it was Peter or someone, maybe Neil, or maybe it was Shimon, who said he was reading the partings of the ways. It is not just a simple parting, and even James Dunn, or Jimmy Dunn, as people who know him called him, said years ago. So in some ways, Christianity and Judaism, we might even say today, have never parted. They have never been able to completely separate themselves. Both hold the Jewish Bible, including the New Testament, which is also written by Jews. Christianity can never entirely leave because it has to reckon with the Hebrew Bible that speaks so much about Israel, and obviously in a literal sense. While Judaism may argue that it can define itself without reference to Christianity, there's some validity to that. Christianity has never been able to define itself without any reference to the Jewish people. Its foundational texts are all composed by Jews from within the Jewish cultural and social world. Some would even argue the books of Luke and Acts being written by Jews. Nevertheless, supersessionism and parting of the ways paradigm are two sides of the same coin. Both rely on the idea that Christians and Jews were very much at each other's throats in the first centuries. While there was definitely some conflict, even persecution, evidence is lacking that it was as widespread and systemic as these viewpoints generally suppose. Secondly, both supersessionism and the parting of the ways viewpoints tend towards a judgment on the Jews for rejecting Yeshua, leaving God to turn to the Gentiles. I want to spend a little bit of time now as we look at that to see what was the attitude of the early believers towards their teachers, and what was the attitude of Jews towards their teachers in these early days, and how does this reflect on supersessionism. Those who taught the Torah in ancient days, Second Temple Judaism, were granted significant interpretive authority both in the Jewish world and within Christian Judaism as a subset of that. This is evident throughout many writings, including the Didache. The Dead Sea Scrolls, with their strong emphasis on the Torah, are particularly helpful, as Wise, Abegg, and Cook propose, somewhat along the line of Norman Golb's challenge to the prevalent hypothesis that they are primarily the library of the Dead Sea Essenes, they don't simply represent one homogeneous community. If these authors are correct, they speak of a wide swath of Jewish convictions or views that were held across a wide segment of Jewish society. All the more so as the Dead Sea Scrolls share certain broad views with the New Testament, including a dualism that is evident in the New Testament and throughout the Hebrew Bible and in the Didache of light versus darkness, the way of God versus the way of the evil one. We see that the views of the Dead Sea Scrolls are worth more than just a passing glance. Various terms are used for teachers in the Dead Sea Scrolls, indicating that not all the teachers had the same status and not all of them had the same function. The preeminent teacher that we've probably all heard about is the teacher of righteousness, a somewhat messianic figure to whom God made known, as the Pesher Habakkuk says, to whom God made known all the mysteries of the words of his servants, the prophets. This teacher is introduced in the same text where the evildoer, the wicked priest, is contrasted with the righteous man. In commenting, the commentary in Habakkuk picks up the third person singular of tzedek, righteous, amplifies the contrast, and identifies the prophets righteous as the community's very own teacher of righteousness. Thereafter, the commentary claims that the words of the teacher of righteousness are from the mouth of God. In contrast, the wicked priest is once again identified in the commentary as one standing in direct opposition to the teacher of righteousness, where he is described as the one who pursued the teacher of righteousness to consume him with the heat of his anger in the place of his banishment. There's been a lot of discussion as to who the teacher of righteousness was and who this wicked priest is, probably one of the Hasmonean dynasty. But while the identities of these two apparently historical figures are not known, it is clear that due to the teacher of righteousness's roles as priest and teacher, he has a lot of influence. In terms of his followers, throughout the commentary in Habakkuk, whoever the righteous may be, they are those who are faithful to the Torah and who are loyal to the teacher of righteousness. Contrastingly, the commentary leaves no doubt that the wickedness of the priest is his lawlessness. That is why he is wicked, and betrayal and persecution of the teacher of righteousness. It's a triad comprising of righteousness, Torah, and the teacher of righteousness that stands in opposition to the triad of wickedness, lawlessness, and the wicked priest. In this way, loyalty to the teacher is directly associated with loyalty to the Torah and the teachings of the Torah as they are presented by him. He has a lot of power as a result. The same need for attentiveness to the teacher is propounded by various hymns of the Hodayot, in which, possibly drawing upon and intensifying the admonition of 4Q instruction, the teacher is somewhat more prominent. There the teacher declares, "Those who walk on the path of your heart have listened to me." He passionately expresses himself in the first person and magnifies his importance. He seems to be very much a narcissist in this text, expansively boasting, "You, God, have established knowledge in my inner being, and you have glorified me." In these examples from the Hodayot, to reject the teacher's instruction, you have to remember that narcissist or not, they kept his writing. To reject the teacher's instruction is to refuse to walk in the path of God's heart and to turn away from the one he has glorified. And so the community apparently accepted these teachings. Their teacher occupied a place of honor and authority. Not only the teacher of righteousness, but also other teachers in the community were to be carefully heeded because of their relationship to the Torah, as other terms for teachers in the Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate. However, the relationship between the teacher of righteousness and other teachers is not always clear. For example, one text warns that failure to listen to the Malit Da'at, the interpreter of knowledge, resulted in many being misdirected by deceptive words uttered by the man of lies. It seems that this interpreter is the same teacher, but the connection isn't explicit, so we're not sure. Some people would suggest that there's a differentiation being made between the teacher of righteousness and the man who studies the Torah, the Ish Doresh Betorah. And the secondary figure, possibly, is the one who interprets the teachings of the teacher of righteousness to the people. He is a priest learned in the Torah whom the community is charged to obey. And Charlotte Hempel further distinguished between the activities of practicing and leading in interpretation and surveyed key texts that led her to the conclusion that they restrict access to the interpretation of the law by referring to individuals and groups with privileged access and special revelations. In other words, just as in some cultic groups today, you can only interpret it as you have been told. It should be interpreted by your teachers, and you don't have the right to do so yourself. Other teachers also wielded a measure of authority in the community, presumably teaching in agreement with the teachers from that have been mentioned, the teacher and the interpreter of the teacher of righteousness. And so we have those who are described and referenced to in the Dead Sea Corpus. The words of Moses advise its readers, "When I have finished the covenant and to decree the path on which you must walk, choose for yourself wise men who will have the task to explain to you and to your sons all these words of the law." Another writing says it is an instruction in righteousness and illuminating reference to teachers. Another one tells its readers, "From all your teachers get more understanding." For the reader, this is an aspect of the faithful life that will result in an abundance of good things. Here the teacher is a maskil. He's presumably not a member of the priesthood, which supplied the preeminent leaders of the Qumran communities. He's not necessarily a leader himself, but his teachings are to be heeded in order to gain understanding. So it is that the maskil in the Serek that we discussed, the Serek that bears so much comparison to the Didache, who stipulated that the instructor should lead them with knowledge and in this way teach the people the mysteries of wonder and of truth in the midst of the men of the community so that they walk perfectly. Thus, in transmitting knowledge to the community, the teacher had powerful influence over the practical conduct of his pupils. The maskil also features prominently in Shir Shabbat, found in the fourth cave, which contains further references to an instructor who occupies a key role in the worshiping life of the community. All of these Sabbath songs are that follow are addressed to the maskil, and the attribution is also the probable incipit of the Serek. Similar to the Didache, this is a text belonging to the instructor who is to teach the holy ones how to live according to the book of the Echad's rule. And so we see that this development of the importance of a teacher, as we see it in the early days of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Second Temple Judaism, bears some resemblance to now the authority that is being wielded in the Didache, and as the Didache seeks to impose its authority on the Didachean communities. This reverence for teachers endured past the Second Temple period. In this period, particularly after the Jewish wars, sayings exalting teachers and ultimately the rabbinate multiplied. And so we see this tendency increasing in Judaism and the rabbis gaining themselves more and more authority. In fact, in part, the rabbinic claim to authority was in connection with their holding of the authoritative transmission of the Torah in a day when the written word was in some ways viewed as less authoritative than the spoken word, because the written word can always be misinterpreted, but the spoken word, you can always ask the person who's speaking it to you what it exactly means and implies. So therefore, in some ways, the spoken word was preferable. In the midst of this, the rabbis gained more and more authority. And we are hopefully familiar with how Pirkei Avot begins the sayings of the fathers in the Mishnah with the saying that Moses received the law from Sinai and handed it down to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets committed it to the men of the great assembly. On the basis that the men of the great assembly were entrusted with the law from Sinai, it was deduced that it was entirely appropriate that the student in the days of the rabbis, the Tanaim, should respect the interpretive authority of the person through whom the law had finally been passed on to, through this chain of succession. In this regard, Mishnah Avot 4 verse 12 attributes the following saying to Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua, one of Rabbi Akiva's disciples, who said, "Let the reverence for your master be like the fear of heaven." And interestingly, you begin to see phrases like this beginning to occur in Christian literature. So as Judaism is more and more, and we see this in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see this in the Didache, as Judaism is increasingly asserting its own authority and a certain group of teachers who hold the oral tradition are becoming more influential, you're beginning to see the same chain of progression beginning to happen in the Christian world as in Christian writings from various writers. The believers are told to listen to the words of their teachers as if they were actually the words of God. The Didache, too, informs its readers that they ought to reverence their teachers. The nearness of Christian Judaism to its Jewish world of thought is possibly preserved in an acknowledgement of an oral law as preserved in Pseudo-Clementine 347, where Peter is said to argue that Moses did not write down the law, but others did out of ignorance. The reverence for teachers, those who orally transmit their teachings, is preserved, as I just said, in the Didache's command to honor one's teacher as the Lord. And so the role of and authority of teachers within Christian Judaism actually becomes part of the tradition of the early church as well. We begin to see more and more the authority of teachers within the early church, both in the New Testament, where their authority is asserted in various ways, and certain apostolic texts. It's Matthew who provides the first record of religious teachers in relation to their role in interpretation and application of Torah within their sphere of influence. And Yeshua, too, paid attention to this, telling his disciples that the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. In other words, the Pharisees did have, and scribes did have authority, but we are not to follow their example. We are to nevertheless listen to and observe what they tell us to do. Matthew laid bare the willingness in his milieu to criticize the Torah observance of the Pharisees as a class, part of the hypocrites narrative that Matthew lays down. The passage is interesting because it doesn't represent a complete put-down of scribes and Pharisees, but is consistent with Matthew's multifaceted characterization of them. This is an early Jewish Christian community, or communities that Matthew presumably is writing for and is in the midst of, and his account includes scribes among Jesus' disciples. In particular, 7 of the disputes that Matthew records between the Pharisees and Yeshua have a decidedly in-house type of aspect. That's why while some writers, Ulrich Lues is one that we could quote, who might decry Matthew's wholesale judgments about scribes and Pharisees, Matthew's characterization only serves to heighten the fact that there was a conflict beginning to take place, a conflict that is taking place in terms of authority. The teachers, the apostles who write the Didache, the people who are the apostles in Jerusalem, they are developing their own authority to teach. And their authority is becoming more and more a matter of concern for the early believers. Well, we can say, since we believe that Matthew is clearly written under the inspiration of the Spirit, is that its concerns nevertheless represent what the early believers were facing in its day. And so the point is, for these early believers, that the yoke of the Torah was not an intolerable burden, because Yeshua doesn't say that, but nevertheless, there was a way in which the Torah should not be observed, and those who neglect fully the observance of the Torah, which they themselves preach, are actually the ones who are under condemnation. All of this should be viewed in the context of Second Temple Judaism, in which Christian Judaism was actually a part in its early years, which were the waning years of Second Temple Judaism. In this regard, and at this time, it was common for various parties to criticize others, partly in regard to their interpretation of Torah and its observance. To this day, this is both a blessing and a curse for the Jewish community as Talmud is interpreted, because it is actually a good situation that there are two main schools in the Talmud, with Shammai and with Hillel, but also the problem of reconciling them, because clearly they had different views, has become was a difficult issue in the days of the Talmudists. There is a challenge. There was conflict. There were different viewpoints in that day. The Gospel of John provides an additional vantage point from which to observe the role of teachers and their authority in a Christian Jewish milieu. J. Lewis Martin is the most noted commentator on John in this regard, although he is dated. And his view was that John reflects a community of Christian Jews that was in the process of becoming separated from the synagogue and becoming a community of Jewish Christians. However, while the gospel corresponds with a milieu or a circle of Jews who are of Christian faith, and of course the word Christian doesn't occur anywhere in the gospel, and addresses issues peculiar to people or community in such a situation, the identity or existence of this community is still hard to settle on. But nevertheless, there are some issues here in this community which may be reflected in the Gospel of John. There's a political context. The center of the conflict in John is often taken to be the conflict between the blind man and the Pharisees in John 9, in which a man whom Jesus healed of his blindness on the Sabbath was brought before the Pharisees and threatened with expulsion from the synagogue. Possibly reading too much into it, J. Lewis Martin takes this to be a reference to a current controversy between the Jewish believers and the rest of the Jewish society that they were in. You have to remember that the theme of light is an early one in the Gospel of John and carries its way throughout. And so the whole idea of the blind man being the one who can see, whereas the Pharisees being blind, is a powerful picture, and no doubt the reason for this chapter being included in the Gospel. J. Lewis Martin believes that this chapter betrays the fact that the Birkat HaMinim was being used in that day, and that it is what lies behind this conflict. But nevertheless, John's Pharisees, while they are depicted in a very controversial way, they are depicted as complete enemies of the Messiah. Nevertheless, they do serve to show that they have authority and that they act as adjudicators in chapter 9 and verse 13, and that they were disciples of Moses in chapter 9 and verse 28. Further, substantiating Matthew's characterization of them as hypocrites in some respects, they viewed themselves as above being taught by one born in sin in chapter 9, verse 34, as can be deduced from their response to the newly sighted man. And then we also read that they ruled on the basis of their position of teachers. And so we see in the Jewish world, there is a powerful stream of awareness of teachers, of being people who have significant influence in the community and to whom the people as a whole follow. Within the Christian world, we see increasing references to hierarchy and towards the authority of leaders. As has already been mentioned, one can see a complete line of progression from the New Testament and its appointment of leaders to the Didache, its confirmation of how leaders might be appointed within the early church, to Ignatius in Antioch, who makes it clear that the churches he writes to should pay attention to their leaders, should listen to them with the utmost obedience, and on to the later writings that make it clear that the teachers of the early church, its bishops and leaders, are in the position of God. We can see in both streams a developing calcification of authority, a developing sense that they are developing their own worlds. And in the midst of that, we're seeing the supersessionism of the early church that is saying our authority is superseding the authority of the synagogue, and the synagogue no longer can lead the Jewish people. This brings us then to the end of what we want to say, in that as we've looked at the Didache and the early church and the emerging sense of awareness between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians of their different identities, as we see in the Didache, the growing awareness of their own callings. We've seen that grow into a I'm struggling to put it into words, into a sense that the church, in some ways, and then ultimately in every way, has superseded Israel, and no longer is Israel the inheritor of the promises which God gave to the patriarchs, but the church. But at the same time, in the midst of it, we've seen the growing patriarchy, you could call it, the growing authoritarian leadership that begins even in Judaism with the temple teachers and the teachers of the Essenes, developing to a point where both groups, differentiated by this supersessionist sword that divides them, standing ultimately in partial, at least, opposition one to another, while at the same time there is a substantial minority who are remaining in between and intermingling the two sides, spoken against by people like Ignatius and Chrysostom, but nevertheless continuing to honor the Jewish roots of of biblical faith and faith in Yeshua, and continuing to mingle both Christian, Gentile practice and the practices of the Jewish people in their faith. Thank you.